Big Shaq was minding his own business when he heard a cruel laugh echo through the alley. "Hand over your wallet, old man." A gang of teens had cornered an elderly man, shoving him against the wall. The old man's hands trembled as he pleaded, but they just laughed. Cameras were out. No one dared to help. But Shaq? He wasn't just going to stand by. What he did next turned the gang's world upside down and gave one teen a second chance he never saw coming. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The night air was cool, but 72-year-old Mr. Jenkins barely noticed. His focus was on the sidewalk ahead, his steps slow but steady as he made his way home. The dim glow of the streetlights flickered, casting long shadows against the alley walls. In his hands, he clutched a small grocery bag, just a few essentials to get him through the week. Then out of nowhere, four figures emerged from the darkness. They moved fast, surrounding him before he could react. The tallest of the group, a teenager with a cocky smirk and a hoodie draped over his head, took a step forward. His name was Trey, and from the look in his eyes, he was used to getting what he wanted. "Yo, old man," Trey sneered. "Hand over your wallet." Mr. Jenkins' heart pounded in his chest. He had heard about the gang of teens causing trouble in the neighborhood, but he never thought he'd run into them. He instinctively clutched his bag tighter. "Please," he said, his voice shaking. "This is all I have." A shorter teen, Marcus, laughed and snatched the bag from his hands. "Oh, we know you don't want trouble." He dug through it, sneering when he found nothing but a loaf of bread and a can of soup. Trey shook his head. "Man, this is pathetic." Mr. Jenkins took a step back, his frail frame trembling. "Just let me go," he pleaded. The gang laughed, their voices echoing through the alley. They thought they were in control. They thought no one was watching, but they were wrong. From the shadows, a deep voice rumbled, low and commanding. "Put it back!" The laughter stopped instantly. The gang froze, their bodies stiffening as a massive shadow stepped forward. The dim light from the street lamp revealed a towering figure, broad shoulders, a thick frame, and a presence so powerful that the air itself seemed to shift. Trey turned his head slowly, his smirk faltering as his eyes landed on the one man he never expected to see standing in front of him. Shaquille O'Neal. The gang's confidence evaporated in an instant. Trey's jaw clenched as he looked up at Shaq, but his bravado was slipping. Oh, shit. Trey's confidence faltered the moment the massive figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows like a giant waking from his slumber. The streetlight cast a long, dark shadow behind him, stretching across the pavement like an omen. At first, Trey barely registered who it was. His instincts screamed at him that something had shifted, that the easy score he had planned was suddenly slipping through his fingers. Then it hit him. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes widened. Oh, shit. Marcus, standing beside him, blinked in disbelief. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "Wait, is that Shaq?" The other two gang members exchanged nervous glances, their postures stiffening. Suddenly, the whole situation felt different. This wasn't some random stranger sticking his nose where it didn't belong. This was Shaquille O'Neal, a man whose very name carried weight. And now that weight was pressing down on all of them, like a boulder crushing a tin can. Shaq stood tall, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he simply looked at them, letting the silence stretch long enough to make the tension unbearable. Then finally, his deep, rumbling voice cut through the cold night air. "You kids are really out here robbing old men?" There was no anger in his voice, no shouting, just quiet, steady disappointment. Somehow that made it even worse. Trey felt his crew shift beside him, their hesitation almost tangible. He couldn't afford that. If he lost control of the situation now, his reputation would be shot. He squared his shoulders, forcing a smirk. "Man, mind your business." Shaq raised an eyebrow, unfazed by the bravado. "Oh, this is my business." Marcus took a step back, nudging Trey's arm. "Yo, bro, maybe we should—" Trey jerked away from him, irritation flashing across his face. He couldn't let fear creep in. Not in front of his crew, not in front of this man. "What, you gonna stop us?" Trey scoffed, his voice louder than necessary, as if trying to convince himself he still had control. "Last I checked, you ain't a cop." Shaq took a slow, deliberate step forward. Trey's stomach twisted as his instincts screamed at him to move. Instead, his body betrayed him. His foot shifted backward before he even realized it. That one mistake, that small, involuntary step was all it took. Marcus and the others noticed, and as soon as they saw Trey hesitate, their own confidence shattered. The two guys on the edge of the group immediately took a larger step back, and even Marcus, the most loyal of them, looked uncertain. Trey swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You scared?" Trey scoffed, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Man, please. Ain't nobody scared of you." Shaq nodded slowly, as if contemplating something. Then, without breaking eye contact, he cracked his knuckles. The sound echoed through the alley, louder than it had any right to be. Trey's body tensed. His mind screamed at him to run, to leave the situation before it got any worse. Shaq took another step, then another. Trey's pulse pounded in his ears. The towering figure stopped just inches away, looking down at Trey with an expression that sent a chill down his spine. Then in a voice so low it felt almost like a growl, Shaq asked, "You sure about that?" Trey's hands clenched into fists as he stared up at Shaq, his pride fighting against the growing unease gnawing at his gut. His crew had already started shifting, the weight of Shaq's presence pressing down on them like an avalanche about to bury them whole. Marcus, the only one who hadn't bolted yet, leaned in, his voice low and urgent. "Dude," Marcus hissed, eyes darting toward the alley's exit. "We should bounce." Trey exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. He couldn't let this happen, couldn't let himself look weak. Not in front of his boys, not in front of this man. "Nah," he muttered, rolling his shoulders back as if that could make him look bigger. "Ain't nobody scaring me." Shaq raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly, as if Trey had just signed a contract he didn't fully understand. "Bet." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Trey's pulse hammered in his ears, his muscles tensed. He didn't even think. His body moved before his brain caught up, pride and stupidity merging into one reckless decision. He swung. His fist cut through the air, aimed straight for Shaq's jaw. For a split second, Trey felt a flash of satisfaction, until reality crashed down. Shaq didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Instead, Trey's knuckles met something far worse than flesh. Stone, or at least that's what it felt like. A shock wave rippled through Trey's hand, up his arm, straight to his shoulder. Pain exploded in his knuckles as if he'd just punched a concrete wall. His fingers went numb, his wrist throbbed. And Shaq? Shaq simply stared at him, slowly, painfully slowly. He tilted his head down to where Trey's fist had landed against his chest. Then he exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "That was cute." Trey's stomach dropped. Before he could react, Shaq took a single step forward, towering over Trey like a skyscraper, casting a shadow over an ant. Trey's breath caught in his throat. He knew in that moment he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Trey's fist collided with Shaq's chest with all the force he could muster, hoping to at least make the man stumble. But instead of the impact he anticipated, it felt like he had just punched a cinder block. A cold, sinking feeling spread through his gut as pain exploded up his wrist. His fingers went numb, his knuckles throbbing as if he'd just swung at an iron door. Shaq didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the punch. Instead, he just tilted his head down, his eyes locked on Trey's trembling fist still pressed against his chest. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "That was cute," Shaq said, his deep voice almost mocking. Trey's breath hitched. Marcus took one look at Trey's reaction, then at Shaq, and his instincts kicked in. "Nah, man, nope, I'm out." Without another word, he turned and bolted down the alley, disappearing into the night. The two other boys, they didn't even hesitate. They were right behind him. Trey's heart pounded as he realized he was alone. His whole crew had left him. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "Figures." Trey staggered back, eyes darting around for an escape route. The alley stretched behind him, dark and empty. The street ahead, too open. He could barely see through the glow of flickering streetlights, his vision blurring with panic. Shaq took a step forward. Trey instinctively took one back. Shaq took another step. Trey stumbled, his back hitting the rough brick wall behind him. His pulse was a drum in his ears. His mouth was dry. His hands were shaking, still sore from that pathetic punch. He had never felt so small. Then, he did the only thing left to do. He turned to run, But before he could take more than a step, a massive hand clamped onto the back of his hoodie. Trey's breath caught in his throat as he felt himself being yanked back with zero effort. Shaq. Grip was unshakable. Not so fast, Shaq muttered, his voice calm, too calm. Trey's feet scrambled against the pavement, his arms flailing, but there was no escaping the iron grip holding him in place. His stomach twisted in fear as Shaq pulled him closer. You wanted to act tough, right? Trey's breath came in ragged gasps. He knew. This was far from over. Trey twisted and thrashed, desperately trying to break free from Shaq's grip, but it was useless. The man's hold was like an iron vise, keeping him locked in place with zero effort. Yo, man, let me go, Trey snapped, his voice cracking slightly as panic bubbled in his chest. Shaq didn't budge, didn't loosen his grip, didn't even look fazed. Instead, he just tilted his head, eyes locked on Trey like he was studying him. You were laughing when he was scared, Shaq said, his voice calm but ice cold. Trey froze. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. The memory flashed in his mind. Mr. Jenkins, shaking, pleading, helpless. He had been smiling, joking, mocking. But now he was the one feeling helpless. Trey swallowed hard. I didn't mean... Shaq let out a deep chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Nah, don't start that. He leaned in slightly, his massive frame dwarfing Trey's as his voice dropped lower. You meant it when you took that bag. You meant it when you laughed. So don't tell me now that you didn't mean it. Trey's eyes darted around the alley. His boys were gone. He was alone. Shaq finally loosened his grip just enough for Trey to stand straight. You want to act tough, right? Then act tough now. Trey frowned, his jaw clenching. What do you want from me, man? Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head toward Mr. Jenkins, who was still standing a few feet away, his hands shaking slightly as he clutched his grocery bag. Tell him, Shaq said simply. Trey stiffened. Tell him what? Shaq narrowed his eyes. Tell him what you just told me. Tell him you didn't mean it. Trey's chest tightened. He couldn't do it. Not with the way Mr. Jenkins was looking at him. Not angry, not even scared anymore. Just disappointed. For the first time in his life, Trey felt something he wasn't used to. Guilt. Trey's lips parted, but the words refused to come out. His heart pounded. Mr. Jenkins waited. Shaq's gaze bore into him. Go on, Shaq urged. Trey swallowed hard. He had no escape. He had to face this. Trey's feet felt rooted to the pavement, as if an invisible force held him in place. His hands twitched at his sides, his fingers clenching and unclenching, as if searching for something to hold on to. He couldn't bring himself to meet Mr. Jenkins's gaze, but he could feel the weight of the old man's presence pressing down on him like a heavy storm cloud. Well? Mr. Jenkins's voice was calm, steady, but it carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be heard. Trey swallowed hard, his throat dry. The words felt stuck, like they didn't want to come out. He shifted on his feet, looking anywhere but at the man he had just tried to rob. The alley felt smaller now, more suffocating, and Shaq's massive presence behind him only made it worse. I'm sorry, Trey finally muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew it sounded weak, but it was all he could manage. Mr. Jenkins didn't react right away. He simply raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. The silence between them stretched long enough for Trey to start feeling even more uncomfortable. Shaq exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Nah, he said, his voice deep and firm. Not good enough. Trey's jaw clenched. A flicker of frustration rose in his chest. Man, I said I'm sorry, he snapped, his voice sharper this time. Shaq took a slow step forward, his sheer size making Trey instinctively tense up. That ain't an apology, Shaq said. That's just words. You don't even mean it. Trey felt his pulse quicken, his fist clenched at his sides, his pride warring with the sinking feeling in his gut. What else do you want from me? He demanded, his voice louder than he intended. His heart pounded against his ribs, the weight of the moment pressing harder than he could handle. For the first time, Mr. Jenkins moved. He reached into his coat pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. Trey's shoulders stiffened. Was the old man about to call the cops? Pull out something worse? But instead, to Trey's complete confusion, Mr. Jenkins extended his hand, offering Trey back his own wallet. You really sorry? Mr. Jenkins asked, his voice quieter this time, but still steady. His eyes, filled with something Trey couldn't quite place, studied him carefully. Trey's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the wallet, his mind racing. He had expected anger. He had expected punishment. But this? He wasn't ready for this. Trey's hands remained frozen at his sides, but his stomach twisted in knots. This was the last thing he had expected. Why was the man giving him back what he tried to steal? Trey had never been in this kind of situation before, and for the first time in a long time, he had no idea what to do. Trey shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders tense as Shaq's towering presence loomed over him. The alley felt even smaller now, the weight of what just happened pressing down on him like a heavy chain. His boys were gone, leaving him alone to face the consequences. The night air was thick with silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head in disappointment. "You want to be a thug? That's the life you're choosing?" His voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It carried a weight, like someone who had seen too many people throw away their futures. Trey clenched his jaw, his pride flaring up. Man, what's it to you? He hated the way Shaq was looking at him, like he saw straight through him. Shaq didn't blink. "It's everything to me," he said, his voice steady. "'Cause I've seen kids like you before, thinking they gotta prove something, thinking this is the only way." He stepped forward, forcing Trey to tilt his head up just to meet his eyes. "But I'm telling you right now, you don't want this life." Trey scoffed, trying to keep up his tough act. But something about Shaq's words hit differently. Nobody had ever said it like that before. Most people either ignored him or treated him like a lost cause. But this felt like a challenge. Shaq studied him for a moment, then pulled out his phone. Trey's stomach dropped. "Whoa! What are you doing?" he asked quickly, his pulse picking up speed. Shaq held up a finger, silencing him as he pressed the phone to his ear. Trey's mind raced. Was he calling the cops? A judge? His mom? He took a step back, suddenly panicking. "Yo, come on, I said I was sorry. You ain't got to do all that." Shaq smirked. "Relax, kid. I ain't calling the cops." He paused, his expression unreadable as someone picked up on the other end. "Yeah, I got a situation. I need a favor." Trey swallowed hard, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "Who the hell are you calling?" Shaq finally looked at him, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "Oh, you're about to find out." The sound of a deep, commanding voice crackled through the phone speaker. Trey couldn't make out the words, but whatever was being said made Shaq's smirk grow wider. Trey's heart pounded. For the first time tonight, he was actually scared. Trey stood frozen as Shaq ended his call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. His stomach churned with unease. Who had he just called? The way Shaq looked at him, calm, almost amused, made him even more nervous. This wasn't over. A few minutes later, the low rumble of an engine echoed through the alley. Trey turned his head as a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb. The doors didn't open right away, but Trey felt the shift in the air. He could tell whoever was inside wasn't someone to mess with. Then the driver's side door swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. Even under the dim streetlights, Trey could make out his piercing gaze and the way he moved. Controlled, powerful, like someone who had trained athletes, fighters, or maybe even soldiers. He looked older than Shaq, but had that same undeniable presence. This man had seen things. Trey shifted uncomfortably. "Yo, who the hell is this?" Shaq crossed his arms. "Meet your new boss." The man stepped closer, his polished black boots clicking against the pavement. He took one long look at Trey, head to toe, then snorted in disappointment. "This is the punk causing trouble?" Trey bristled at the insult. "Man, I ain't no punk." The man raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Shaq chuckled. "Coach, this one's got some fight in him. Just needs the right lesson." Trey blinked. "Coach?" His stomach dropped. The man stepped forward and jabbed a finger into Trey's chest. "Name's Coach Robinson. I've trained some of the toughest kids in the city. Some made it to college. Some made it to the NBA. Some thought they were too good to listen. Ended up nowhere." He tilted his head. "You gonna be one of them?" Trey swallowed hard. Robinson didn't wait for an answer. He clapped a heavy hand on Trey's shoulder, gripping it firmly. "Hope you like hard work, kid. 'Cause you just signed up for hell." Trey's mouth went dry as Robinson tightened his grip. He didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time in a long time, he was genuinely afraid. Trey dragged his feet as he walked onto the cracked asphalt of the basketball court, the early morning sun glaring down on him. His muscles ached from barely sleeping, his mind still racing after last night's events. He thought maybe, just maybe, the whole thing had been some kind of scare tactic. Something Shaq and this Robinson guy cooked up to make him rethink his choices. But the second he stepped onto the court, he knew he was dead wrong. Coach Robinson stood in the middle of the court, arms crossed, looking as sharp and disciplined as a drill sergeant. Shaq leaned against a goalpost, watching, arms folded, with that knowing smirk that made Trey's stomach turn. Trey rubbed his temples. Man, I thought this was just a talk. Robinson's smirk widened. Oh, you're going to learn plenty, kid. Trey glanced around. The court was old. Real old. The backboards were faded, the rims rusted, and trash was scattered everywhere. Broken glass shimmered near the fence, and the faded white paint of the free throw lines barely clung to the asphalt. It looked abandoned, like nobody had cared about this place in years. Trey frowned. What is this? Shaq pushed off the post and walked toward him, holding something in his hand. Trey expected a basketball. Instead, Shaq handed him a broom. Trey blinked. What the hell is this for? Shaq raised an eyebrow. Lesson 1. Clean up. Trey let out a short, humorless laugh. Nah, man, I'm here to work, not to... Before he could finish, Robinson stepped forward and snatched the broom from Shaq's hand. Without breaking eye contact, he shoved it into Trey's chest. Hard. You want to be a man? Robinson growled. You start by respecting what's in front of you. And right now, this court deserves better than you. Trey's jaw clenched. His pride screamed at him to drop the broom and walk away. But then he caught Shaq's eyes. Steady, challenging, waiting. Trey exhaled sharply. Man, this is so stupid. But he grabbed the broom. Robinson smirked. Good. Now let's see if you can finish before the sun burns you alive. Trey gulped. This was just the beginning. Trey dragged the mop across the court, his arms burning, sweat dripping from his forehead onto the faded asphalt. The once filthy surface now gleamed under the afternoon sun. 5 days in, and this court had gone from a forgotten wasteland to something that almost looked alive again. He still thought about quitting. The first morning had been the worst. His back ached from sweeping broken glass. His palms were raw from scrubbing the rusted rims, and his patience was at an all-time low. At first he grumbled, cursed under his breath, and resented every second of it. But every time he thought about walking away, Shaq's voice rang in his head. You want to be better? Then prove it. So Trey stayed. Coach Robinson wasn't easy on him. The old man had him running drills, lifting buckets of sand to build strength, and waking up at dawn just to pick up trash before the day even started. Trey hated it until he didn't. One afternoon, after finishing another round of sweeping, Trey leaned on his broom, taking a deep breath. For the first time, he looked at the court with something other than resentment. It looked different now, cleaner, like a place that mattered. Yo, kid. Trey turned and saw Mr. Jenkins, the old man he had tried to rob just days ago, walking toward him. He had a small bag of groceries, but his usual cautious grip on them was gone. He wasn't scared of Trey anymore. You've been out here every day, Mr. Jenkins said, stopping beside him. He glanced around at the court, nodding. Didn't think you had it in you? Trey scratched the back of his head. Yeah, well, I didn't either. The old man studied him for a long moment before giving him a rare smile. You ain't the same kid from before. Trey swallowed, the words hitting harder than he expected. For the first time, he realized he didn't want to be the same kid from before. Trey exhaled, gripping the broom tighter. I'm trying. And for the first time in his life, he actually meant it. Trey wiped the sweat off his forehead, his heart pounding like a drum inside his chest. It had been weeks of grueling work, sweeping courts, running drills, waking up at the crack of dawn. But now, it all came down to this. Shaq stood a few feet away, arms crossed, towering over him like a statue. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, not doubt, but expectation. You ready to prove yourself? Shaq asked, his deep voice cutting through the quiet evening air. Trey took a slow breath. He didn't hesitate. Yeah. Shaq smirked and tossed him a basketball. Trey caught it, the worn rubber familiar in his hands. But this wasn't just any shot. This was the shot. Coach Robinson, standing near the sideline, nodded toward the hoop. One shot, kid. Make it count. Trey took a step toward the free throw line, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement. The court felt different than it had when he first stepped onto it. It wasn't just a place where kids played ball anymore. It was a place where he had changed, where he had become someone new. He gripped the ball tighter, remembering every lesson Shaq drilled into him over the last few weeks. Balance, focus, follow through. He exhaled and bent his knees. The world around him faded. The sounds of the city, the weight of the past, the doubt that had once clung to him like a shadow. This was his moment. Trey released the ball. It spun in slow motion, the seams rotating, cutting, through the air. For a split second, everything stood still. The ball soared toward the hoop. Trey held his breath, watching. Would it go in? Or would everything he worked for come crashing down? The ball sliced through the air, spinning in perfect motion, its path locked onto the hoop. Trey's breath caught in his throat as it reached the peak of its arc. Then it dropped. Swish! The net rippled as the ball sank cleanly through. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, cheers erupted. Coach Robinson let out a low whistle, nodding approvingly. Not bad, kid. Shaq grinned, stepping forward. You did good, Trey. Trey exhaled, his hand still frozen in the follow-through position, as if he couldn't believe it actually happened. He turned to Shaq, who extended a fist. This time, when Trey bumped it, he felt like he'd earned it. Mr. Jenkins stepped forward, a proud smile on his face. You ain't the same kid I met in that alley. Trey turned toward him, suddenly feeling the weight of everything, the bad decisions, the moment he almost lost himself, and the second chance Shaq had given him. He reached out, shaking the old man's hand. I owe you both, he said, his voice steady. More than you know. Shaq nodded. Then pay it forward. Trey met his gaze, understanding exactly what he meant. He wasn't just some kid running the streets anymore. He had a choice, a future, and this time, he wasn't going to waste it. He glanced at the court, at the people who had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. This wasn't just a game. It was the start of something new. Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder, his smirk returning. Just don't mess up again. Trey grinned, shaking his head. Not a chance. As he walked off the court, the city lights glowing behind him, he knew one thing for sure. His old life was over. A new path was just beginning.